Today we have some more actual history about the man known as the Indian Slayer, Tom Quick, who lived in eastern Pennsylvania near the border of New Jersey and New York. In this episode, we will first hear several stories about battles that Tom Quick's neighbors had with the Indians. We will hear about two young men named Osterhout and Anderson, and their capture and escape from the Indians. Then we will hear about the sad fates of a foolhardy military leader named Graham, whose recklessness and audacity led to a massacre by the Indians. We will then hear about two young 18-year-old women settlers and their capture by the Indians in Ulster County, New York, about 30 miles northeast of Milford, Pennsylvania, where Tom Quick lived. Then last, we will hear of another encounter between Tom Quick and an Indian, this one at a boarding house where several hunters had gathered for the night. We will be reading from this book, Tom Quick, the Indian Slayer, by James Quinlan. This book was published all the way back in 1851. So here are the next major events that occurred in the life of Tom Quick and his neighbors around the beginning of the United States Revolution. Wauwersing and vicinity suffered much from the Tories and Indians during the War for Independence. The Loyalists living upon the frontiers and professing neutrality, or sympathy with the Whigs, acted as spies upon their rebel neighbors, and by their perfidious hypocrisy escaped the vengeance of those who, if they had been certain of their character, would have made their fate a terror to all white savages. The Tories engaged too in the murderous expedition of the Indians against the Whigs, but were always painted and disguised in such a manner that they escaped detection. And the only thing that rendered their presence apparent to those upon whom they fell was the color of their eyes. All tradition agrees in representing the atrocities committed by the white adherents of the British king as being of a more revolting character than those of their uncivilized allies. And it is not surprising that the Sons of Liberty, after the close of the war, committed various outrages upon their former unnatural enemies. At an early period during the war, an outrage was committed on the family of a widow who lived at Lackawanna. She kept a public house there, and it is said some of the Indians were incensed against her household because they had not been supplied with rum as liberally as they desired. One evening, while her son Jacob Osterhout and a man named George Anderson were in the house, 3 Indians entered it, and took both of them prisoners. The woman escaped and reached Wauwersing the next day. She wandered all night in the woods with nothing on but her nightclothes, and it rained during a part of the time. Osterhout and Anderson were taken far into the interior, and it is supposed that the Indians encamped with them a few miles from the present site of Binghamton. Osterhout was not a rugged man, and was nearly exhausted with fatigue, when Anderson, who understood the Indian language, heard the Indians speak of killing his fellow prisoner, because, as they said, his scalp would be worth more than he would be alive. Anderson apprised his friend of the conversation of the Indians, and they mutually resolved to escape if possible. When the Indians encamped the next night, they built a large fire as usual. During the evening, and probably while eating their supper, they inadvertently left a knife on the ground near Anderson. Unperceived by them, he covered it with leaves, using one of his feet for the purpose. The Indians soon after missed it, but providentially failed to find it. Finally, after securing the prisoners as they supposed for the night, the Indians, who had during the march been joined by a couple of squaws, laid down to sleep, a sleep which proved longer than they anticipated. During the night, Anderson recovered the knife, with which the 2 white men cut the thongs which encircled their wrists and arms. They next secured the hatchets of the Indians, and then concerted a plan to kill them. It was agreed that Anderson should dispose of 2 of them, who lay on one side of the fire, while his companion should give the fatal blow to the other warrior, who was sleeping directly opposite. As it turned out, Anderson had to knock all 3 of them on the head. The first one he struck sprang upon his feet, and then tumbled into the fire. Anderson then struck the second, whom he killed instantly. Looking toward the third, he found Osterhout in a panic, and the only remaining Indian still asleep. Anderson immediately dispatched the unconscious sleeper. He had now time to look around when he discovered that Osterhout had a hold of the first Indian, and was endeavoring to drag him out of the fire. Being weak and timid, he had become completely unmanned in the excitement of the moment, and acted like a madman. Just before the close of the tragedy, the squaws woke up, and made the woods ring with their cries. They either escaped or were spared by the white men. Anderson and Osterhout made instant preparations to return. They knew they had no time to lose before commencing their long and fatiguing march, as they were well aware that the squaws would bring down upon them a host of Indians from the next village, which was but 13 miles distant. If retaken, they were certain that the most horrid tortures awaited them. Taking from the dead Indians whatever was of service to them, they started for home. Osterhout traveled slowly, and Anderson was compelled to assist him in their flight. Once he was obliged to swim a stream with his feeble friend on his back. Long before they reached Lackawanna, the small supply of food they had taken from the Indians was exhausted, and they were suffering the tortures of starvation. They had guns and powder and shot, but were afraid to use them through fear of being discovered by the Indians. They did not dare to follow the usual route, nor travel in the daytime. Fortunately, when they were reduced to almost the last extremity, they met with a horse with which they killed with a spear, and cut from it a supply of meat, which lasted them for a day or two. When this was gone, they were obliged to fast until they reached Wawasink. Their sufferings were almost incredible, and they had undergone so much hunger that if they had given an unrestrained license to appetite when they reached home, death would have ensued. Osterhout, as it was, fell a victim to the hardships he had endured, for he did not long live after he reached Wawasink, and even the strong-minded and robust Anderson never recovered from the effects of his captivity and escape. He was insane during the remainder of his days. He was constantly in fear of some great danger, and retired to a cave in a neighboring town, from which he would sally at night to pilfer from his neighbors whatever he needed. He was generally regarded as of unsound mind, although some thought his conduct was caused by remorse for killing the Indians. However this may be, he was considered an object of pity, and no one endeavored to have him punished for his offenses. He lived in this manner for several years, and finally disappeared. Where he went or what was his fate is unknown. It was rumored after his disappearance that he had gone to the far west, and again lived near the Indians. The insane timidity he had exhibited after his escape leads us to think that this report was not well founded. The mysterious manner in which he abandoned his old haunts adds not a little to the romantic character of his life. Not long after the events described in the preceding chapter, the natives made another attack on the outpost of Ulster. On the outskirts of Pine Bush lived 3 families named Shirker, Miller, and Baker. Early one morning, the military of Rochester were alarmed by the cry of Indians, and it was discovered that the buildings in the direction of the neighborhood of Shirker, Miller, and Baker were on fire. Captain Benjamin Courtright, a bold and true man who commanded the militia, immediately marshaled his company and marched toward the scene of danger. When they reached the burning buildings, the Indians were seen retreating, and the dead body of Shirker was found. His skull had been cleft with a tomahawk. Miller had been shot a short distance off. The Indians and their brutal allies had literally riddled his body with bullets. Baker's friends never saw him or heard from him afterwards. It is probable that he was burnt by his captors in revenge for the 3 Indians that were tomahawked by Anderson. The women and children of the 3 families were spared, a fact so remarkable that it is difficult to assign a motive for it. The valiant Captain Courtright pursued the enemy until his provisions gave out, when he returned. It is not improbable that he was censured by some of the Hotspurs of the frontier for not overtaking the Indians and engaging them in battle. There was a fort in those days on Honk Hill, where some 300 troops were stationed. When it was ascertained that Courtright had returned without accomplishing anything, Lieutenant John Graham, an officer noted for his reckless daring, volunteered to pursue and waylay the enemy with only 18 men. He was offered a greater force, but very foolishly refused to accept it. His men were raw recruits who knew nothing about Indian warfare, and the results proved that Graham knew but little more of the traits of the enemy than his followers. The unfortunate lieutenant managed to reach the locality now known as Grahamsville in advance of the Indians. He selected a place here to surprise the enemy, which, above all others, gave that enemy the advantage of him, although if his force had been sufficient, and his whereabouts had been unknown to the foe, it would have been a very good place in which to lay an ambush to intercept and cut off the Indians. It is a short distance from the residence of Mr. Neil Benson, where a brook empties into the Papacton, and where the surrounding hills form a kind of basin, with narrow gorges leading up and down the streams. From this place Graham sent his only good marksman, a man named Abraham Van Campen, to procure some venison. Before the Indians reached the ground, they knew Graham's situation, and formed a sure plan of massacring him and his whole party. Silently and with cat-like caution, they surrounded him. Posting themselves on the high ground within rifle shots, they had an opportunity to deal death and destruction, which has been rarely surpassed. But they were not content with this alone. One of their number was directed to approach the whites by the usual path, and thus draw their fire. As he came in sight, Graham was drinking from the brook. When he rose from his recumbent posture, he discovered the Indian and directed his men to fire. As they aimed, the Indian fell upon his face, and the balls whistled harmlessly over his head. He immediately disappeared in the bushes with a loud whoop, as a murderous fire was poured upon the whites from all directions. Most of them, including Graham, were shot down, and only 2 besides Van Campen returned to tell the tale. Truly, their fate shows more plainly than can words that discretion is the better part of valor. A short time after the battle, a force of 300 men went to the scene of action to bury the slain, a force which should have been sent in the first instance, and under a commander, too, who understood the character of the Indians better than did the poor Graham. All the dead were found scalped and divested of their clothing. Trenches were dug, and the bodies consigned to their last resting place. No monumental stone marks the locality where they repose, and no one living can point out the exact spot where they are silently mingling with the dust. A number of years since, a near relative of one of the victims visited the battlegrounds to discover the bones of those who fell, but after searching several days ineffectually, he returned to his home disappointed. One of the first settlers of the northeastern part of the town of Schauengunk was Johannes Jansen, who held a colonel's commission during the Revolutionary War. On account of the position he occupied among the patriots, he was much hated by the Tories and Indians who infested the neighboring mountains. He was not molested, however, until near the close of the war, when the Indians had removed to the western country, and he no longer apprehended an attack from them. On a Monday morning in September, he had occasion to go to a barrack near his barn, where he encountered 2 Indians who attempted to grasp him and take him prisoner. He, however, eluded them and ran towards his house, which was a stone one at full speed, and shouting "Murder!" One of the Indians got so near him that he stretched forth his hand to take hold of him. The colonel, however, got into the house soon enough to close the door behind him, before the Indian came up, but he failed to bar and bolt it. A trial of strength ensued between the 2 for a few moments, one endeavoring to force open the door, and the other trying to keep it closed. The colonel proved the strongest, when the Indian discovered a broad axe in the porch, and endeavored to force open the door with it. Jansen, however, frightened him away by calling loudly for his pistols and musket. As soon as the Indian had left the porch, the colonel took his station in the entry with his musket and pistols, resolved at all hazards to prevent anyone from entering. His wife, deeming it most prudent to close the window shutters for the purpose of darkening the room, and thus concealing herself as far as practicable, raised the sash for that purpose, when a fellow disguised as an Indian pointed his musket at her and drove her back. The blue eye of the disguised Tory betrayed the white man. The assailant succeeded in effecting an entrance into the lower part of the house. The party consisted of 4 Indians and 1 Tory, each armed with a musket and its deadly accompaniments, the tomahawk and the scalping knife. Among these was one, perhaps the leader of the gang, named Ben Shanks, who had spent his younger years in the neighborhood of Colonel Jansen, and many times labored for him on the farm. This fellow was well acquainted with every part of the county of Ulster, which then included Sullivan, and was chiefly noted for his peculiar atrocities in time of war. He was at this time about 40 years of age. In person he was tall, slender, and athletic. His hair was jet black, and clubbed behind, his forehead high and wrinkled, his eyes of a fiery brown color, and sunk deep in their sockets, his nose pointed and aquiline, his front teeth remarkably broad, prominent and white, his cheeks hollow and furrowed. In a word, Ben Shanks, when arrayed in all the warlike habiliments of his nation, presented one of the most frightful specimens of human nature that the eye could rest upon. Like the others of his party, he now wore a coarse wagoner's frock of a grayish color, with a red handkerchief bound closely around his head. Not many months anterior to the time to which we are speaking, a young woman by the name of Hannah had come up from the city of New York, where her parents resided, for the purpose of paying a visit to the family of her uncle, Mr. Christopher Mintz, who was by occupation a tailor and lived not far from Colonel Jansen's house. She was in the bloom of life, aged about 18 years, possessed of handsome features, and in all respects what might be termed a comely girl. Being of an industrious disposition, she employed herself in spinning in the family of Colonel Jansen. It appears that she had spent the Sabbath previous to the fatal Monday, of which we have been speaking, at the house of her uncle, and was just returning through the gateway at the end of the barn to resume her occupation at the wheel, when the colonel's 3 female slaves, who had been captured by the Indians, were placed beside the kitchen door under the care of Ben Shanks. As she passed the corner of the barn, one of the slaves discovered her from the kitchen, and motioned to her, in the most forcible manner that circumstance would permit, to keep back. But the poor girl, having not the least suspicion of danger, paid no attention to the signals of the slave, and walked leisurely forward into the kitchen. When she was informed of her danger, however, her terror became extreme. She wrung her hands in agony, and besought the unfeeling monsters, in terms that would have pierced a heart of adamant, to spare her life, and let her remain where she was. In these entreaties she was warmly seconded by the female slaves, but all in vain. One of the monsters seized her by the hand, and with his uplifted tomahawk, compelled her to take her station by the side of the slaves at the kitchen door. Gathering up the spoils they had collected in the cellar and kitchen, the enemy ordered the slaves with the unfortunate girl to advance, while one of them led the way across the fields, toward the mountain. The luckless maiden again used every effort to prevent her being carried off, but the ruffians, turning a deaf ear to all her entreaties, seized her by the arms, and dragged her away from the door. Mr. Christopher Mintz, of whom mention has already been made in this narrative, was a native of Germany, and resided at this time in a comfortable log tenement, about 3/4 of a mile west of Colonel Jansen's seat. He had already lived beyond 20 years and 10, and with that never-tiring perseverance so peculiar to his countrymen, he had the satisfaction to support a young and thriving family solely by the exertions of his needle. John, the eldest of his children, was now in the prime of life, having reached his 24th year, strong, active, and fleet, and passionately addicted to the pleasures of the chase. He had married the daughter of a humble citizen on the farther side of the mountain, previous to his entering the service of the state. As the Indians and Tories had more frequent opportunities of committing their depredations upon the defenseless inhabitants on that side of the mountain, his father-in-law, John George Mack, had been in the constant habit of removing for safety all unseasonable apparel to the house of Mr. Mintz. It happened, unfortunately, as will be seen in the sequel, that Mr. Mack with his youngest daughter Elsie had come over for the purpose of bringing home the winter clothing of the family, at the time when Ben Shanks and his party paid their unexpected visits to the residence of Colonel Jansen. On the morning of the ever-memorable Monday before alluded to, they had prepared their stock of clothing in 2 separate parcels, and got everything in readiness to return home. Their route lay through the woods along an Indian footpath, leading directly across the mountain, and the distance from the house of Mintz to the first habitation on the other side was 9 miles. When they had proceeded nearly 4 miles through the woods, and reached the foot of a precipitous ridge, not far from the summit of the mountain, Mr. Mack remarked to his son-in-law that he had now gone far enough, and he might prepare himself to return. The old man then seated himself on the ground, against the trunk of an oak tree, and made preparations to light his pipe, while his daughter Elsie, a sprightly girl of 18, ascended about 5 feet above him. The spot upon which they had now located themselves was singularly wild and romantic. From the top of a large flat rock not more than 15 yards above them, they could distinguish the 2 lofty promontories which confine the Hudson at Newburgh, more than 1/2 of the town of Shawangunk, and a great portion of the county of Orange. The soil was thinly covered with tall trees of oak and maple, and a thick underwood of the ever-verdant laurel. They had scarcely been seated for the space of 10 minutes, when 2 horses that were grazing in the bushes on the right of the path suddenly lifted up their heads, pricked their ears, and looked steadfastly towards the east. Presently, however, they again betook themselves to grazing, and nothing further was thought of it. But the sagacity of these animals could not be deceived, for a few minutes after, as the old man was in the act of striking fire into his tinder horn, they again raised their heads as before, and with pointed ears, stared more fiercely in the same direction. Mintz now remarked that there must certainly be something more than common near the horses, or they would not behave in so strange a manner. Perhaps it was a deer or a bear, upon which the old man cast his eyes over his right shoulder, and seeing plainly through the bushes, he suddenly exclaimed, "They are Indians!" The other, rising up on tiptoe and looking over the tops of the laurel, replied, "No, it is a Tory with slaves." On a closer examination, however, John at length distinctly recognized the frightful visage of Ben, who, with 3 slaves behind him, was gradually edging toward them in a circuitous direction, and under cover of the laurel bushes had already advanced within 10 paces of his prey. The plan adopted by this artful Indian for the capture of the whole party was evidently this. While the blue-eyed Tory with his 3 red brethren descended the hill about 100 yards, and took post upon the path to intercept them in their progress downwards, Ben himself, with the 3 slaves at his heels, cautiously inclined toward them, under cover of the bushes, and aimed to strike the path just above the girl. As he was thus advancing slowly at a distance from his comrades, with the 3 slaves following in file behind him, it seemed manifest to Mintz that he labored under certain fearful misgivings in regard to the fidelity of the slaves, for although he did not cease to keep a watchful eye upon the unarmed individuals before him, yet ever and anon he cast keen and threatening glances at those who followed his steps. From the fatal experience of many bereaved families in the country, Mintz was at no loss in apprehending the object of Shanks. Unarmed and having no hope of safety but in flight, his first idea was to mount the animal bound to the rock oak sapling, and ride at a full speed down the path. But a moment's reflection convinced him that by adopting this course, the horse must inevitably stumble in proceeding swiftly over the stones lying in her way, and he accordingly abandoned it as impracticable. Passing then directly under the neck of the animal, he ran off with the utmost speed. As he turned abruptly towards the south, on reaching the bank of a brook that ran down from the mountain, he heard a loud and distressing scream from the girl. The spot upon which he now stood was nearly 15 feet perpendicular from the surface of the stream, and not deeming it prudent to waste any time in seeking for a more convenient place of passage, he resolved to spring from the bank towards the body of a tree that grew near the water, and laying hold of it to slide gradually down to the roots. In doing this, however, his velocity was so great that his hand slipped in the act of seizing the tree, and he fell down upon his feet in the bottom of the brook. Rising up immediately, he again attempted to resume his flight, but found that his left ankle was severely sprained, and that his shoes, being filled with water, greatly impeded his progress. To divest his feet of these impediments was but the work of a moment, and then, regardless of his painful ankle, he held his way, o'er swamp and hill, through bush and briar, till he suddenly found himself on the verge of a field belonging to Thomas Jansen, a brother of the colonel who lived about 2 miles distant, and not above 200 yards from the house. Seeing persons passing and repassing, he hailed in a loud tone, and was answered by the well-known voice of one of his friends. In the meantime, Colonel Jansen had alarmed the inhabitants of the town, and several parties of men had collected at various points to prepare for a vigorous pursuit of the enemy. After relating his tale of woe to those assembled at the residence of Mr. Jansen, Mintz proceeded in haste to the house of his father, and having there repeated the same mournful intelligence, he took down his faithful rifle, and, disregarding the acute pain in his sprained ankle, quickly retraced his steps up the mountain path. On arriving at the spot where the Indians were first discovered, he saw several gentlemen employed in the examination of a bundle of clothes found at the foot of a tree, the mystery of which, as may well be supposed, he soon cleared up. It was then concluded that the Indians had either murdered Mr. Mack and his daughter, and concealed their bodies in some part of the forest, or else had carried them captive to answer some horrible purpose they had in view. But when it was considered that, in the latter case, the bundle of clothing, instead of being left behind, would most probably have been carried along with them, and that the old man had invariably expressed his determination never to follow any Indians as a prisoner of war, the majority of the persons present inclined to the opinion that they had both fallen victims to the deadly tomahawk. A search was, of course, immediately resolved upon, and seeing a remnant of the bridle still hanging from the sapling to which Mintz had fastened his horse, it appeared evident that the animal had broken loose, and strayed with its fellows into the adjacent woods. After a short examination, tracks were distinctly recognized leading in a westerly direction, towards the before-mentioned brook, and the first impulse of the party was to follow them in that direction, searching carefully on each side as they passed along. When they had crossed the brook, and descended about 10 paces up a gentle declivity, the unfortunate objects of their search were at once exposed to view. The corpse of the poor girl lay stretched at full length upon the bank, with the clothing she had worn properly arranged, and her father lay upon his hands and knees about 5 feet lower down, at the foot of a rock oak tree. Both were scalped in a most horrible manner. From the position in which the old man was found, it appeared evident that he had struggled long in the agony of death. His hands were clenched and filled with leaves, and his head hung down between his shoulders. Having contemplated the sad spectacle for some moments in silent astonishment, some gentlemen of the party prepared a temporary bier to convey the bodies to a house, that the last solemn service due to their mortal remains might be decently performed. As they were upon the point of proceeding homeward with their melancholy burden, they perceived with grief that their unhappy friend Mintz was unable to move. Overcome by the heartrending scene which his lifeless relatives exhibited, and exhausted with the pain of his sprained ankle, he found himself utterly incapable of exerting sufficient strength to follow the mournful procession. But the sun was now set, and he was not in a condition to pass the night in the forest. Supported therefore on each side by the arms of his friends, he was eventually enabled to descend from the mountain, and to enter the comfortable but now mournful mansion of his kind, commiserating parents. The next day a strict search was made in the fields and woods in the vicinity of the colonel's homestead for Hannah, who was no longer with the Indians when they attacked Mintz. When the party were almost to the point of abandoning their object in despair, a dog belonging to one of them was observed to direct his course towards a lonely field in which no careful investigation had yet been made. His master followed him and soon came in sight of the mangled corpse of her whom they sought. Like her friend Elsie, she too had been scalped, and the bleeding skull excited feelings of horror in those who came to witness the scene. She too was transported in silence to the humble mansion of her venerable uncle, and from thence in due season to that solitary bourne from whence no earthly traveler returns. Previous to the Revolutionary War, a man named John Showers lived in a log house near the falls of Mongop. One evening some 5 or 6 hunters met at his house, which was quite a resort for such people. As the cabin afforded somewhat better accommodations than the forest, they concluded to avail themselves of its shelter for the night. Tom Quick was among the number. During the evening an Indian came in, and asked permission to remain all night. He was told that he could stay. The evening was frosty, and a rousing fire was kept up. The hunters amused themselves in telling stories of their adventures. One of the hunters was boasting of his skill in shooting at a mark, and told in what manner he shot a panther. "I had a tussle with a bear once," said another, "and dang me, it was curious." Late in the evening a goodly number of logs were placed on the fire, and the hunters, wrapping themselves in their blankets, laid down upon the floor to sleep. They were soon in the land of dreams, except Tom, who was watching quietly for a chance to kill the Indian. One would imagine that he had shed blood enough already, but the more Indians Tom killed, the greater was his desire to destroy them. When the breathing of the sleepers showed that they were sound asleep, Tom threw aside his blankets, and cautiously and noiselessly got his gun. In a few minutes the hunters were awakened by an explosion. They found themselves bespattered with brains, and the Indian dead in their midst. Quick, immediately after firing, left the cabin, and disappeared in the forest. The hunters, after consulting, concluded that the murder of the Indian should be concealed, in order to avoid any unpleasant consequences that might follow, if his brethren knew of it. The Indian was buried in the morning, and his death was unknown to any except the hunters, until concealment was no longer necessary. So that's it for this episode. This is episode 5 in our series based on this 1851 book by James Quinlan, Tom Quick, the Indian Slayer. Most of these stories were about other people who lived near the border between Pennsylvania and New York during the time of the United States Revolution. Tom likely heard about many of these people who were captured or killed by the Indians, and this may have further increased his desire to take revenge on them for killing his father. There isn't a lot of information that I've been able to find on some of the people who were attacked by Indians in these stories, outside of this book. It is unclear whether Oosterhout had some medical issue that forced him to rely on Anderson during their escape. I haven't been able to find any information about Anderson and how his mental health collapsed after his escape. There also isn't much information about the 2 young women who were killed by the Indians in Ulster County, New York. Let us know in the comments if you have any information about the people mentioned in these stories. In the next episode in this series on the life of Tom Quick, we will hear about more settlers who were attacked by Indians during the U.S. Revolutionary War, and we will hear about Tom Quick's actions during the war. As in the French and Indian War, Tom Quick would not join the army or any militia, but he would serve as a scout, and assist with the war effort in his own unique way. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that has now been cast aside as unworthy to discuss on history channels on TV. Here on this channel, we preserve these heroic tales of our ancestors by reading directly from old books, unadulterated by the opinions and machinations of modern so-called historians. If you'd like to support our channel, then you can join our Patreon page or become a YouTube channel member. Members will have full access to all of our members-only videos, and your contribution towards keeping actual history alive will be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.